I thought I had 20 minutes, and I thought that was going to be awfully tight. 10 minutes is going to be much harder. And whatever I had planned to say changed significantly on, I guess, Saturday night when I turned on the email and watched the news. And Judge Richard Goldstone had published his article in the Washington Post, because what I'd like to say, and if I get cut off in the middle because I still haven't got my PowerPoint working, no, that's not the right one. Where is it here? Oh, there, okay. Got it, okay. Since F5 still works, okay, F5 still works. Okay, so talk straight into the microphone. This doesn't count yet for time. I want to make my point right at the beginning, and that way it's the Schlafstunde, people can fall asleep, I'm going to run out of time, I'll get off into a tangent. What we have been discussing all of Israel in the last 48 hours or so, or for the last 2 years, or in fact since the Durban conference of 2001, in terms of the abuse of human rights and international law, the branding, if you will, or the negative branding of Israel that was discussed in the earlier panels, the way in which organizations that claim to promote human rights, that use that language, have branded themselves as the saints. There's a term that's used called the halo effect. All of that is the dominant factor. With all due respect to people who study the role of the media, I'm going to argue that it is the organizations that have captured the language of idealism, of morality, of human rights, of international law, of humanitarian aid, and have twisted that language, have in a sense hijacked that language for very partisan ideological and political purposes, that they are driving very much of the process which requires Israel in particular, but also much of the Western world, to respond through what we call public diplomacy. It's the use and abuse of soft power. And I see these organizations, and I'll talk about that to the extent that I can, as the engine that drives that process. Ostensibly, or ideally, in theory, we're living in an age of morality, of human rights, of international law, as far more powerful, at least in the West, than nation states, than petty politics, than partisan politics, than even democratic politics. This process actually began, the emphasis on moral principles. The modern version of that can be traced to after the Holocaust. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I don't have enough time to say it properly, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, meaning one set of standards that applies to everybody, in theory, was adopted in 1948 in the shadow of the Holocaust. Also the Genocide Convention. Institutions like universal jurisdiction, like the International Criminal Court, like the United Nations now Human Rights Council, but formerly the Commission on Human Rights, and Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the various European parallels to that, all of these organizations, and it is a multi-billion-dollar euro-pound industry, and I use that word cynically because that's, as I will say, is what I think it is, have become very central to international politics. And it's only in the last few years that those of us who study international politics have even become aware of that. And even later, that governments, the State Department, and very belatedly the Israeli Foreign Ministry, I don't know if anybody's still here from the Foreign Ministry, a little bit, yes. Some of the members of the Foreign Ministry, it's almost non-existent, or it was very much non-existent in the past. Just to very briefly lay out the issues here. The dominant factor, I will talk about the Goldstone Commission, I will talk about the Goldstone Report, I will talk about the Goldstone article in the Washington Post as briefly as I can. But the context of that was the United Nations Human Rights Council. The mandate, the choice of Richard Goldstone, was formally driven by an organization that is dominated by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, meaning Libya, Iran, Egypt, Algeria. The majority of the members of the United Nations Human Rights Council are in fact the worst violators of human rights in the world. And this cynical process is very much joined and given validity by organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and at least 1,500 organizations. That's where the origins of a lot of, or the mechanism, maybe not the origins, but certainly the mechanism for what we have called the delegitimization of Israel, the demonization, the negative branding of Israel. That's what's driving the process. And it goes far beyond issues like the occupation, like settlements. The Durban Conference of 2001, and particularly the NGO Forum, 1,500 non-governmental organizations attended, participated, lent their names, their energies, their money, their resources to this conference. And this is the language that they adopted. Everything that we see in terms of the negative branding of Israel, the labeling of Israel and Israelis as war criminals, as violators of human rights, systematic, the worst in the world, of responsibility for collective punishment in Gaza. All of that terminology, all of that labeling is seen in the, I just took some excerpts, it's actually far more detailed, from the 2001 NGO declaration at the Durban conference. The number of times the word apartheid is used, ethnic cleansing. This is not a disagreement about how to deal with the settlements in the occupied territory and the two-state solution or not solution. This is about the existence and the legitimacy of the State of Israel. And this process was clearly declared, articulated by the NGO community in 2001, and it has been implemented systematically ever since. It's been implemented, I could give you 10 different case studies. I'm only going to use the Goldstone example because it is the apex of this process. As soon as, or perhaps even before, the beginning of the Israeli response to the rocket attacks, the systematic rocket attacks, the thousands of rocket attacks from Gaza took place. On December 28, 2009, immediately afterwards, 2008, through the entire Gaza war and afterwards, the NGOs and the UN Human Rights Council immediately met and condemned Israel. They created the framework which became the Goldstone Commission, and then they were able to find, after one, it was repeated, by the way, in the news media, I should have said that, it was headline story day after day, Human Rights Watch, all of the stories that you saw, allegations of war crimes, of illegal use of weapons, the whole white phosphorus claims, all of the so-called 36 incidents which were supposedly examined in the Goldstone report, which were provided by Amnesty International and was adopted, all of the text was adopted through the media by the UN Human Rights Council and then found its way into the Goldstone report. And of course, then from there becomes, because it's in an official UN report, then our academic colleagues immediately quoted. All of this is, we say in Hebrew, Torah Sinai, it's unquestioned. It has got to be absolute truth. It is the NGOs that drive this process, time after time. I prepared this, I've used this PowerPoint in different forms for quite a while. I prepared this before the Goldstone article in the Washington Post. But it was the apex of the process because the text of the Goldstone report is largely based on all of these reports that were issued. There were over 50 NGOs in that period of about 3 weeks of the Gaza war had published condemnations of Israel. The ratio is about 9-to-1, which is almost exactly the ratio in the Goldstone report. 9 condemnations of Israel, 9 demands for investigations, for boycotts, or rather for legal procedures, for investigations by the International Criminal Court, UN action, for every one mild rebuke of Hamas. That is the context, and it is the direct copy of the claims that were made by the NGOs. There is almost no value added. It's the same incidents, it's the same, quote, evidence, the same sources of information, largely what are called Palestinian eyewitnesses, and the question of what they actually witnessed is, of course, an open one, a point that I will not get into very much detail of. This was very much formulated, I'm doing this as quickly as I can and I'll get to the end very quickly. It was packaged in what we call lawfare. Here's a slide from an Al Jazeera program which showed a conference. Look at the language that's used, a conference on impunity and prosecution of Israeli war criminals. There were approximately, what we're told, about 200 NGO representatives. From there they went to London and Spain and Holland and Canada and the United States to initiate cases against Israeli officials that were primarily designed to brand Israelis as war criminals. And it was sponsored by the European Union and by Oxfam. The couple more points that I want to make, and I'm skipping through examples, a very blatant connection with anti-Semitism in this process. I'm not saying that all of this is anti-Semitic. I'm saying that you see a gradual transfer from the hostility and rejection of Israel and the use of terms like apartheid in the claims to the use of classical anti-Semitic and very racist and offensive themes. The language that's often used and the claims that are, I said, are very much unreliable. I'm going through this too fast and I should have skipped some of these slides, but this is 12 cases in Lebanon which we looked at in great detail and showed in almost all of the examples that they gave, they got the facts wrong. But they become the reliable sources that are used throughout this process. The amount of money, as I said, is huge. We're talking about organizations that have multi-million dollar budgets. The European Union is very much responsible for the abuse of terms like human rights by funding these organizations to the tune of at least 100 million euros a year, which is basically filtered to about 100 organizations that are, without this money, without these organizations, there would be no Goldstone report. 90% of the text would not have been written. And that's another element of this. I'm going to stop going through the slides and just end with a couple of points here. And that is what I interpret from reading not only the Washington Post article, but having read carefully every public speech that Judge Goldstone has given since at least January, and having been at one of them at Stanford University, is that the realization that the claims that were made, the agenda that was given or written, which, as Judge Goldstone said, he tried to change, but was not in fact changed by the Human Rights Council. All of that gained tremendous visibility and impact because of the role of non-governmental organizations. And what I really read through the Goldstone statement is that these organizations, it's not just that you found one judge who perhaps without understanding the complexities of the issues or for whatever reason agreed to be part of this process, but it is a very powerful process that needs to be looked at much more carefully. I want to end by saying that this is not a diatribe against non-governmental organizations. It's a 10-minute presentation about the role of NGOs in the framework of what has become a negative branding process and a political warfare process and the difficulties of responding to that. This is a panel of NGOs. I had an NGO. Non-governmental organizations are not, per se, by definition, organizations that pursue immoral agendas or promote claims which are not factually credible, but rather these are organizations which, like any other political power, given too much money, too many resources, and no standard, substantive, systematic criticism, like any other system, power is easily abused, power corrupts, and it's not absolute power, but unchecked power corrupts in a very unchecked way. And what we see through this process is precisely the abuse of NGO power. It needs to be checked and examined like any other source of political power.
Thank you.